PAP and CHAP are two very important protocols for authentication, but what do we need to know about them for our Security Plus exam? That conversation starts right now.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome back to Security Plus here at IT Pro TV, and today is all about PAP and CHAP, two of the greatest, if not the greatest, authentication protocols. Wes, I know you're chomping at the bit to get into PAP and CHAP and all the goodness they can provide us when it comes to authentication. Where do we begin?
I'll tell you what, by not believing all the sensationalism behind those protocols, and I'll tell you why. Let's go ahead and let's talk a little bit about just authentication protocols in general, and then we'll do exactly what Dan says. We'll move into the password authentication protocol, and then this little thing called CHAP. Well, what are authentication protocols? Well, when we look at authentication protocols, really what it's about is authenticating identities. Now, not just users, because I want you to know that authentication protocols can be used not to just authenticate like a human, if you will, the user, but it can also be used to authenticate what they call NPEs, a non-person entity. For instance, maybe two routers are communicating, right? And they need to authenticate between the two routers, right? There's not a human interaction, if you will. So that's why I said authenticating identities. But if we take it into the context of maybe a human here, right? We've got a user wants to log in. They're going to be challenged by some kind of server. And we've talked about this authentication and authorization in other episodes, right? So remember authentication, I'm just going to say, hey, I am, and then you're going to be challenged, right? And whatever the other part of that process is, it could be a server. Really, it could be any other device that supports authentication, but we'll just take an example of a server. Server's going to say, well, you are who you say you are, prove it, right? And how do we prove it? Well, when that challenge comes back to prove you are who you say you are, you pass a password, username and password. Now, one of the things that we want to make sure when it comes to usernames and passwords is that we do keep them protected, and that's why we need to talk a little bit about, especially this first one coming up, PAP, because what we don't want to happen is our bearded, well-groomed, hooded hacker out here to be able to be out there sniffing on the wire and gain access to those credentials, and that's important. So, this is one of the reasons I said about, the glamorization of PAP, and that's because, well, we want authentication to happen, but again, we want the passwords to be secure. And when password authentication protocol came out, it really was one of the first authentication protocols that allowed you to do what? Well, when that authentication request comes in from the user, in this case, just the same thing here with a server, there's a challenge is going to be made. Well, in this one, it says, prove you are who you say you are. Well, what does Bob do? But Bob sends his password across the wire, and he's either authenticated, which means it's an authentication acknowledgement, or something else that might happen is an authentication negative acknowledgement, right? We have ACK and NACK. If you hear ACK is an acknowledgement, we talk about the TCP three-way handshake, right? We have the SYN-ACK, right? That's a synchronization acknowledgement. So you'll see this ACK and NACK a lot, right? But I want you to focus on something, right? With password authentication protocol, its sole purpose was to allow you to authenticate, all right? And here's the thing. It did nothing to protect that password. It is one of these clear text authentication protocols, which means if somebody's out there sniffing the wire, let's say Dan's out there and maybe he's doing a little, I don't know, we're doing port mirroring, capturing all that information, or just running something like Wireshark Protocol Analyzer, and he grabs that raw data right off the wire, feeds it into Wireshark and says, yeah, let me follow that stream there. Well, guess what? He can grab the password and then he could replay it later. So that's the problem with PAP. And that's one of the reasons I said, well, it's one we typically want to stay away from today because it's considered insecure. And we've talked a lot about this through the series that we never want to send clear text out there in the wild or over the network.
We tend to see this, cat and mouse game between technology as it comes up like, hey, I need to do X. Yep. So somebody really quickly figures out how to do X. Mm-hmm. It might not be secure, but it does the thing you need it to do.
Sure.
And then, of course, the bad actors come along and they go, ooh, there's flaws all through this. And they start exploiting them. This one being that it's sending these credentials in plain text. If I'm able to grab that stuff, obviously now I know what it is and I can authenticate as somebody who I'm not. Then, obviously, the people come behind and go, well, that was dumb of us. We should do something better than this.
Yeah, so let's
what have they done?
They went with chat, but I like that. I like what you pointed out a really good point that, hey, we need something to happen, so we made it happen. We gave you the technology. Well, when this first came out, in fairness to the engineers, in fact, Dan and I were talking about this. If you remember back to your Network Plus days, how were we using PAP? Well, we were using PAP with something called the point-to-point protocol, right? PPP, if you will. And in those early days, they were really going over point-to-point serial line interfaces, which means there wasn't really any sniffing the wire, right? To get into the network, you literally had to do a wiretap, right? I'm not saying it's impossible, right? But technology's progressed, right? Things like PPP allowed you to basically make point-to-point connections over a wide range of media: Ethernet, ATM, SONET, so a lot of different mechanisms, right? And those mechanisms also brought in that cat and mouse game. And that is where we get into the next one you're asking about there, and that's something known as CHAP. CHAP is the Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol. And we're going to talk about a few more protocols here, but with this one right here, okay, think about a handshake, right? What happens in a handshake? Now, we're here in 2021. We
So
definitely
you're passing COVID.
I was going to say we've got to think a little bit more about how we be a little bit more careful about our handshakes. But CHAP, there's going to be a process that goes back and forth. All right, and here's how it kind of works. All right, we have our user. Our user is going to make an authentication request. Now, interestingly enough, the server in this aspect is going to send back a challenge. All right, a challenge is just technical jargon for a random string of bits that it's going to send back. Now pay attention to what's going to happen here. Let's say Bob here, we're going to use our security terminology, right? Bob and Alice, right? Bob here is going to use something that only he knows, provided it hasn't been exploited, something only he knows to encrypt this challenge. What's he going to use? Well, he's going to use his password. All right. And this actually all happens in the process of typing in your password. Don't think that you're literally...
So Bob's not over there with like a slide rule and doing math.
Exactly. Sitting there soldering and electrical currents
man.
and stuff.
They're never going to break this.
That's right. Just want the packets to have nice bows on them.
Yes.
So what he does is he encrypts that challenge, or his machine does, with that password, right? Now we have that encrypted challenge, and it's encrypted with something only really Bob should know. Well, then that encrypted challenge is sent back over to the authenticating device, right? In this case, I'm using a server as an example. All right, now, the server then takes that encrypted challenge, all right, and in a database, guess who also knows Bob's password? Well, the server knows the password, right? He has to verify that you are who you say you are. So you can take, the server takes that password of Bob's and decrypts, reverses the encryption. They can assume, the server can assume that Bob is who he says he is because the challenge came over, encrypted it with his password. Only Bob should know the password. When it's sent back, the password decrypted that encrypted challenge. Now, if, let's say, I'm the hacker. Let's say Bob, for whatever reason, walked away from his computer, but it's locked, and I decide to enter some kind of password. We're doing guessing, right? We're not even talking about software doing it, guessing, right? And I enter the wrong password, right? Obviously, I don't know Bob's password. Well, I can encrypt the challenge, absolutely, with the password that I just typed in. But here's the thing, when it gets back to the server is still going to use Bob's password. And it's going to say, let me remove, oh, that didn't work. Well, you can't be who you say you are because I know Bob's password, and what you're giving me here cannot be decrypted with Bob's password.
So this is an example of a type of symmetric key encryption.
Yeah,
They both are using the same key.
That's right.
To encrypt and decrypt.
That's a great way. It's a PSK. It's a pre-shared key, which is a technical jargon for a password.
I know, a real fancy way of saying that's your password.
That's exactly it. So, and the big takeaway between this one and PAP, what we just seen, is think about, and again, let me just finish that. It can be the authentication is confirmed, or the authentication might be denied. And if it's denied, then that means the password wasn't right. But now let's put our hacker out there on the wire. Hacker's sniffing the network, right? But there's something different here than there was with password authentication protocol. Notice that Bob's password stayed within the endpoints. It never hit the wire. And because it never hit the wire, you could sniff that encrypted challenge. In fact, let's go even a step back. Let's say that the hacker grabs the random bits, right? It sniffs the whole process, the whole handshaking process, and in the second step there, grabs that challenge and says, haha, I'm going to encrypt this message and send it back to the server in like a replay type attack. Well, it's no different. when the hacker sends that information, or attacker, I should say, threat actor, sends that information, that encrypted challenge back to the server is going to say, well, you're telling me you're Bob. Let me use Bob's Oh, that didn't work. So either way it happens within the handshaking process, right? That's going to keep Bob's password off the wire, and it's going to keep it out of the database of the attacker here.
Well, obviously we are now safe and secure. We have nothing to worry about. CHAP is our savior, and this has been a great episode. Thanks so much.
Unfortunately.
I feel like you've got something else to tell me.
That's right.
Some bad news, is it?
Not really, because there are some flaws around
Oh,
the
no.
CHAP, challenge handshake authentication protocol. And in the earlier days, really, it was just a one-way authentication. It's the server challenging Bob, and that's it. So there are variants, all right? And I want you to be aware of some of the variants and where you might see them. Because remember, one of the goals of these authentication protocols isn't just to spit a whole bunch of jargon at you and say, memorize that. It's not that good, right?
Sure about that, Wes?
Well, some of it might be okay, but you need to synthesize a little bit. Where do we actually apply this? So CHAP really today is going to be used, if at all, in a non-Windows environment, because Microsoft came out, like they do with a lot of products, they made their own flavor, if you will, of CHAP. That's Microsoft's CHAP implementation. However, the older CHAP has problems. It was better than the earlier authentication protocols like Landman, the NT Landman. That's not a very good database and a secure way of protecting passwords. But MS CHAP is weak. So what they did is they said, well, we got to do a little bit better, and they came out with a version 2. So today's standard authentication, especially in Windows environments, is MS CHAP version 2. And it brings to the table mutual authentication. So both endpoints can authenticate. All right, I want to know you are who you say you are before I even try to authenticate. What, I'm just going to send you my password? Are you who you say you are? Maybe somebody stood up a bogus or a rogue server. All right, and it's doing CHAP authentication, right? So you can do this both ways, and it also allows for a lot stronger cryptographic keys. So this is what you're going to be using inside of your Windows environments, and really you can combine this with things. We'll talk a little bit more about EAP coming up in another episode, but you can combine this with other frameworks and make it even more robust today.
Oh, wow. Well, that's nice to know that we still seeing these authentication methods that were once old are now reused and new all over again, and still being used throughout our systems to authenticate us as end users. That being said, we are done with this episode, but there will be more authentication methods for us to look at and peruse throughout the Security Plus series. So join us then. Until then, we do thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.